Hey everyone, good morning. Got to walk into Skate by Silk Sonic. How cool is that? And if you ever feel conscious about being on Zoom and watching yourself on 4 big screens while you're on stage is even worse. How you all feeling? As they say in the airline industry, thank you for choosing this conference. Out of the 20 conferences you've gone to in April and May, everyone decided to do theirs in May, but we're so glad you're here. I'm Benji de la Peña. I have the privilege of leading a team of amazing transportation geeks, which we call the Shared Use Mobility Center. And thank you, a big clap for my teammates who have helped us put together. And I have the privilege of introducing someone who will welcome you all, who I have so many privileges of calling my mentor and guide, and she's been helping me shape the Shared Use Mobility Center since I stepped on in 2021. Long experience in shared mobility. He founded Philly Car Share, grew it to be the largest regional car sharing network. He was the Global Public Policy and Sustainability Officer at Bird. He was the Chief Partnership and Strategy Officer for Goa Sendal. He was the head of ITDP, CEO of ITDP. He was the COO of Embark and a deputy director at World Resources Institute. And he is the chair of the board of the Shared Use Mobility Center, Clayton Lane.
Hey all, it's great to see you here. Good morning. It's great to see new faces and old faces, good friends. Isn't this an amazing space? The team has done just an incredible job, so creative. To design this space for us. We're going to have a lot of fun. As Benji mentioned, I'm the chair of the board. I'm Clayton Lane, chair of the board of the Shared Use Mobility Center, and I have the privilege and the honor of welcoming us all and kicking off our 2023 National Shared Mobility Summit. It was a decade ago that we had the first summit in San Francisco. It was organized by UC Berkeley and by Sharon Fagan. Sharon then went on to found SUMSI and become our first executive director. And during those 10 years, so much has happened. You've seen it. So much innovation, so much progress. Yet at the same time, there are some imperatives that don't change, that stay the same. One is equity. Equity imperative. We will continuously recognize that the current transportation system was built on racist and discriminatory assumptions, and that without active intervention in how we design and govern shared mobility, that transportation system will continue to propagate social injustice. This is incredibly important. Let's take safety, for example. Riding a mile on a bicycle in a US city, a black person is 4 times more likely to die on that bicycle, whether shared or personal bike, than a white person. And research shows that safety divide is rooted or correlated geographically with the historic redlining of neighborhoods. These were the neighborhoods that were bulldozed as part of urban renewal, and where high-speed arterials then increased speeds, increased deaths, and made it very inconvenient to take public transit and other forms of shared mobility. So how do we design shared mobility services, but also infrastructure today to ensure that we promote equitable, safe shared mobility? The second big imperative is the climate crisis. As you know, we have a climate emergency. The transportation sector generates 28% of GHG emissions in this country, and that's a figure that has not gotten better in these past 10 years. Transportation is the largest source of GHG emissions in our country, and research shows that electrification, while necessary, is insufficient on its own, that we need shared mobility and walking and cycling to account for about half of the GHG emission reductions that we need by 2050. So our work together here is incredibly important. Now we've got some challenges. We've got some post-pandemic challenges. Amid this backdrop of equity and climate imperatives, we have the public transit fiscal cliff with reduced revenues post-pandemic from fares, and also with the drying up of COVID relief funds. So we've got a big challenge there to tackle together. And we also have in the private sector companies like Lyft and Bird, where I used to work, and Tier and others who have laid off quite a few people and are retracting services. So we have some real challenges here. But the good news is we are here to talk about solutions. I want you to think about the people who are next to you in the room right now and how you'll be working with them over the next couple of days. How together we can drive action and accountability to advance shared mobility. And in fact, we've already started. We established the 2030 Shared Mobility Action Agenda with 70 companies, NGOs, and public agencies, including many of us right here in this room. And that action agenda lays out the blueprint for what we as a community feel is critical for advancing equitable, low-carbon shared mobility into the next decade. And at this conference, at this summit, we'll talk together about how to continue shaping that agenda. We'll address questions like, how should we design infrastructure, technology, and services to promote shared mobility? How should we measure the equity and climate impacts of shared mobility and help private companies reduce their life cycle emissions? And institutionally, how can we fill that pernicious funding gap, both in public transit and in other shared mobility, and create the processes needed to ensure that we have affordable, accessible, shared mobility for all? So we've got some really exciting speakers these next 2 days. In addition to your NGO and academic and private sector colleagues, we will hear from Veronica Vanterpool, the Deputy Administrator for FTA. Thank you for being here. We'll have a conversation with Gabe Klein, the Executive Director of the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. We will hear from author and urban activist Allison Sant, who is also now a SUMSI board member. And we'll hear from Chris Coes, the US DOT's Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. And to make sure that we don't stay all policy wonky, we're also going to have our imagination stoked by the amazing artist and urban planner, Chicago's own Theaster Gates. Make sure you don't miss that. So with that, I formally open the 2023 Shared Mobility Summit. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Clayton. Now I have well, Clayton gave it away, so you know who's going to be our keynote speaker. Who's a sci-fi fan here? Sci-fi readers, raise your hand. Okay. Who are N.K. Jemisin sci-fi readers? Her latest book, The City We Became, is one of my favorites. The plot is simple. New York City, every borough has an avatar who represents the energy of that borough. And when I think about our next speaker, she is the avatar, or should be the avatar, for the Bronx, one of the boroughs that suffered the worst from our urban renewal and running highways through our neighborhoods, right? So she's a native New Yorker, raised in the Bronx. Now she's the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Transit Administration, but before that, she was the Chief Innovation Officer at the Delaware Transit Corporation. And also, before that, the Deputy Director of the National Vision Zero Network, so hitting safety and innovation there too. She headed the New York City-based Tri-State Transportation Campaign and is a member of the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority. But the best thing I can say about her is something, which is the highest compliment for any person, actually. Something our new board member, Midori Valdivia, says, right? She said, "Oh, we have Veronica. She's good people." Veronica?
Hello. So who recognizes that song? All right, it's a transportation transit theme song, right? Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Benji. Thank you, Clayton. Thanks to the team here at SUMSI. And I will not start without thanking our FTA team here. Kelly Brookins is our regional administrator for this region, Region 5. And of course, our wonderful team, Christina and Rick. And they form so much of the foundation of the work that we do here at FTA. So I am excited to be in this group. It kind of brings me back to my roots in advocacy, in promoting shared mobility, and just to be in a space with people who share a lot of the same values. So to be used, occupied, enjoyed, with another or others. That's the definition of shared. Shared spaces, shared goals, shared values, shared mobility. The ability to connect on shared streets and in community is a motivation for why we gather here at SUMC. I'm among a crowd and an audience of people that shares values that are at the core of public transportation. Equitable, accessible, and sustainable transportation choices are essential to healthy communities. Public transportation is the original shared mobility model. Equity, accessibility, sustainability. These are the pillars of our work at Federal Transit Administration, and it reflects the values we promote. So let's start with the pillar of equity. FTA has been doing equity for 59 years. We aren't just on the equity bandwagon because we're all talking about equity. Whenever you provide an alternative mode of transportation for individuals who have no other way to get around, you are fostering and promoting equity. We've been doing this for 59 years since FTA was created as the Urban Mass Transportation Administration in the 60s by President Kennedy. 59 years, we're turning 59 this summer in July. So we've been working on this for a long time. 28 million people in the United States have no other way to get around except on buses, trains, ferries, streetcars, bikes, scooters, and their 2 feet. Many millions more rely on these options because the alternative is not great. Yet, despite our collective efforts, when these mobility options are presented, they can have inherent inequities. It's the bus that crawls along in mixed traffic. It's high speed limits and the absence of sidewalks in rural and tribal communities. It's the 4-lane roadway with 1 crosswalk every quarter mile. And it's the subway ride you miss because it's too crowded to get on. These are the inequities we have been tasked to correct in the Biden-Harris administration. The first administration to issue more than 12 executive orders on equity, with the very first one signed by President Biden on his first day in office. So one of the ways that Federal Transit Administration addresses these inequities is through our grant programs. So you want cleaner buses, especially in communities disproportionately impacted by pollution with high rates of asthma? We at FTA have $1.6 billion for that. You want accessible rail stations so persons with disabilities can live productive lives? We have $1.7 billion for that. You want development centered around transit to mitigate sprawl? We have $13 million for that. You want to address transportation insecurity, so lack of transit is not the reason you missed a doctor's appointment? We have $6 million for that. So we've heard of food insecurity, and we've heard of housing insecurity, but now we're thinking and talking about transportation or mobility insecurity. And this is a condition when people are unable to regularly and reliably satisfy the travel necessary to meet the needs of daily life. So a few days ago, the Urban Institute released poll results that showed 1 in 5 US adults, 20%, have foregone needed health care in the past year. Oh, nope, not yet. In the past year because they do not have a car and have limited access to public transit. That is transportation insecurity. But when there was access to good public transportation, that percentage went from 20% to 9%. FTA is addressing this inequity with the award of our first grant of $6 million to support a research team at the University of Minnesota that will identify and research factors that contribute to transportation insecurity. This team is going to help us help you find solutions to transportation insecurity. In fact, there's going to be a session later today at 3:30 titled Understanding and Evaluating Mobility Insecurity. And my former colleague and friend, Karina Ricks, is going to be on that panel. Karina was instrumental at Federal Transit Administration in crafting and designing this grant award that I'm just sharing with you. So addressing transportation insecurity advances equity. Remember, our first pillar, equity. Expanding and improving public transportation leads to equal outcomes. But advancing equity today sometimes means rectifying the transportation mistakes of yesterday. The city of Orlando was carved up by the construction of Interstate 4 in the 1960s. Highway planners routed it through the community of Paramore and took 550 parcels. That meant 500 homes and businesses along that way. As the Orlando Sentinel editorial put it, the highway effectively walled off the predominantly black neighborhood from Orlando's downtown district, resulting in economic disinvestment over time. But with the support from FTA, Orlando and its Lynx transit system built a network of bus rapid transit lines to reconnect Paramore to the city's downtown. FTA provides opportunities to change the future of communities. We provide opportunities to change the future of communities by offering new ways to travel. For example, in rural New Mexico, a new, more efficient bus facility supported by FTA allows NCRTD to use savings from reduced facility costs and take that savings and reinvest it into the public transit system to provide more bus service for 70 tribal communities. Our next pillar, accessibility. Transit can be a great equalizer. Riders of all incomes, ethnicities, and disabilities and abilities should have the same access to transit. But unfortunately, that's not the case. In fact, just a few years ago, only 25% of rail stations in the US were accessible. But thanks to $686 million in fiscal year 22 grants, funding provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law, FTA awarded the Chicago Transit Authority $118.5 million for renovations like elevators, ramps, and better platforms to allow level boarding on trains. That's going to have a significant impact here in Chicago. When the ADA was passed in 1990, fewer than 10% of CTA's rail stations were ADA compliant. Today, over 70% of Chicago's rail stations are accessible. And CTA has plans to make all remaining 42 stations accessible in the next 2 decades. We have to thank Senator Tammy Duckworth for this progress. As a double amputee who lost her legs in service to our nation, she knew exactly the challenges faced by those with disabilities. With that knowledge, she became an unstoppable transit champion for this program. And this just shows that having representation that reflects the needs of transit riders, it makes a difference, whether you're in Congress, whether you're on a transit agency board, or whether you're at the federal agency such as FTA. This money is essential to expanding accessibility. These are old legacy systems, and they're expensive to retrofit. So this funding will make a difference toward accessibility. We know access in our transit systems is more than just access to rail platforms and bus stops. It's also access to quality transit that conveniently connects people to jobs, to services, to institutions. Bus riders in Wilson, a small city in rural North Carolina, had access to transit, but buses only came once an hour, and fixed route service only served about 40% of the city. This is a challenge in any community, but it's certainly a challenge in Wilson, where 1 in 4 people lives in poverty, and nearly 12% of residents do not have access to a car. FTA helps support Wilson's on-demand microtransit service pilot, and today ridership triples previous fixed route service. And the city estimates that over half of the trips are for work commutes. So we want to hear right now from the city's Chief Planning and Development Officer.
Very proud to say in the last month, we've set 3 new weekly ride records. And so one of those, we hit 4,700 trips in a week. What we wanted to accomplish was helping people get to work or get to these essential errands. But the stat I'm really most proud of is it's like just over 50% of our trips amongst the people that responded to the survey are journey to work.
I've had my own experience launching on-demand microtransit when I worked at Delaware Transit Corporation. At the time, we won an FTA grant. I actually applied and won for it when I was there and was part of the AIM cohort, many of whom gathered yesterday as part of the IMI and MOD convened by SUMC and supported by SUMC. And it was a wonderful opportunity to launch in this rural community. Delaware used existing cutaway buses, and they worked with a private mobility provider. And while service was already provided in this rural, largely agricultural and community where 38% were Latino and about 46% of the population lived below the poverty line, we were incredibly excited to launch this service in rural Delaware. Service was already provided, but just like in most rural communities, it was infrequent. Headways were about an hour, sometimes 75 minutes. So we knew that residents and employees and visitors in that community needed more. So we created a smartphone app, but we also created a 1-800 number because we understood the demographics and the needs of the population we were trying to serve. And not everyone had access to a smartphone. So we made sure we had a 1-800 number with a live person on the other end who could use the software and book the ride for them. And that was incredibly important from an equity perspective. So riders were able to pay the same $2 fare that it cost for the fixed route service, and they received a ride in 15 minutes or less. And what the data showed is that riders were overwhelmingly using Dart Connect to get to their jobs at the poultry manufacturing plants, to get to a work release program, to get to rehabilitation services, to get to employment at a big box store. This was literally the lifeline and the connection for people's livelihoods and people's health. So on-demand microtransit is indeed expanding the perception of shared mobility and changing lives. In Memphis, here we go. In Memphis, where some community members are living, 38% of a particular community in Memphis are living in poverty. On-demand microtransit is expanding the perception of mobility in this Memphis community. So listen to this rider using Memphis's on-demand service.
So I use it to go to grocery shopping, Aldi's, Cash Saver, go to First Tennessee Bank, and I couldn't walk to Walmart. So I love it because I can get put off right at the door at Walmart. That is so great. And then they come right back to my gate and let me in.
And these are the sorts of lived experiences that are being captured by our team at FTA. You know, in the engagement that they have with grantees, they're pulling these stories, and we're sharing these stories with you all. So FTA was one of the early investors in shared mobility. Since 2016, FTA has awarded $260 million to over 400 projects. And many of you in this room have participated and or been recipients of that and are working in your communities and with our FTA team on that investment. So we've invested in everything from transit apps to ride-sharing software to multimodal payment systems. So we leverage the impact of our investments with organizations like SUMC, which runs the Mobility Innovation Collaborative. And I mentioned that many people gathered yesterday for MIC to talk about their lessons learned and their best practices and just to support each other in this work. Thanks to SUMC, they are supporting you all and providing the technical assistance and the valuable resources to make sure that we are advancing shared mobility. It is these kinds of partnerships that leverage our funding, FTA's funding, and federal resources to seed and develop the innovations that have an impact in people's lives. So thanks again to Benji and the SUMSI team. So turning to our last pillar, sustainability. We heard from Clayton, 28% of greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases are contributed to by the transportation sector, but we should be very, very proud that in our work, we contribute a very small sliver of that. In fact, transit contributes less than 1% of that emission. And we know this, right? Transit investment is a climate mitigation strategy. People on transit means less GHG, less sprawl, less congestion, less pavement. FTA has been mitigating climate change for 59 years. The same way we've been working on equity and accessibility for 59 years, we've been working on climate change mitigation for that amount of time as well. Since 2021, FTA has provided funding for the replacement and purchase of approximately 6,900 low or zero emission vehicles, ranging from ferries to rail vehicles to vans and of course buses. This is to help transit agencies transition to all electric fleets. And thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, we've ramped up our efforts. We have a lot more money now, a lot more money to make these investments. Since the law was signed, $2.9 billion is going to cleaner, greener buses. And while a trip on a diesel bus is definitely still significantly better than traveling in a single occupancy vehicle, electric buses emit 62% fewer GHG than an average diesel bus. And we're very glad to support this transition. Today, there are over 1,300 electric buses on the road. 5 years ago, there were 363. And with this increased funding, another 1,800 buses, 1,100 of those will be zero-emission buses, are coming to streets in your communities, our communities, in the short term. And over the next 5 years, FTA is dedicating funding to convert up to 10,000 fossil fuel-powered transit vehicles to electric vehicles or low-emission transit vehicles. So agencies large and small are making this transition. In fact, 222 transit agencies, including CTA here in Chicago, have signed on to FTA's climate challenge. FTA issued this challenge in 2021 to encourage transit agencies to be bolder in reducing GHG. Smaller agencies like Minnesota Valley Transit Authority and Everett Transit in Washington State are rivaling bigger agencies like CTA and New York's MTA with their fleet transition plans. But we also have agency leaders like Antelope Valley Transit Authority in Lancaster, California, which is the first agency in North America to meet its 100% electric fleet goal. That's incredibly impressive. FTA is not just investing in transit capital. We're investing in sustainable transit planning. And since 2015, FTA's transit-oriented development program has provided more than $90 million to help communities plan walkable, dense, mixed-use development near transit. People who live near transit will use transit. We're focused on affordable housing, a priority of the Biden-Harris administration, and applicants addressing anti-displacement, zoning reform, or homelessness will receive additional consideration in grant reviews. Equitable TOD has been successful right here in Chicago. When Chicago passed the Connected Cities Ordinance, calling for more equitable TOD in the city, Elevated Chicago went to work. Elevated Chicago is working with the city to transform vacant land near CTA rail stations for affordable housing for essential workers. In fact, just yesterday, the city of Chicago announced 26 grant recipients totaling $4.7 million from the Mayor's Office of Planning and Development for equitable transit-oriented development to reduce congestion, to support seniors who are living near transit, and to ensure that there's connection to food opportunities. So shout out to the city of Chicago. So when we think of TOD, we often default to housing developments. But in Atlanta, the nonprofit Station Soccer partnered with MARTA to install soccer fields at 5 rail stations. The soccer fields are not just next to the stations, they're part of them. And this connection gets kids, this transit connection gets kids to these fields, but it also gives these kids connections to experiences and opportunities. So in closing, I want you to know that at the Federal Transit Administration, our mission is to improve America's communities through public transportation. We do that by investing in your ideas. And your ideas have expanded the model of shared mobility beyond the subway or bus ride. We can't and we won't let this once-in-a-lifetime generational opportunity of increased funding, new technology, and committed champions pass without advancing transformational change. So bring us your ideas, share your vision. We want to advance the best practices and capture the lessons learned from our investments in public transportation. As we advance our shared spaces, our shared goals, our shared values, our shared mobility, we make the most progress in partnership with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Thank you so much, Veronica. I don't have my mic on. You got my mic? There we go. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Veronica and the team, and FTA, equitability or equity, sustainability. You've heard people talking about mobility as a service. I'd like us to be talking about mobility as a human right. Right? We need to do that. And we can only get there with shared mobility.